Thank you very much, John and Carl, for having me. Thank you, dear guests, for joining us this evening. I was just chatting with Carl and John before the lecture, and I said, you know, as an economist, I grudgingly have to admit that politics is really important for development. And it is true that, you know, when one looks at so many countries, including my own, economic policy can do a lot of very important things, and it's clearly very, very crucial. But if one gets the politics wrong, if the politics derail, as we saw, for example, in ex-Yugoslavia, then even quite decent economic policies cannot really yield the results expected. So the interaction between politics and economics is crucial to development. It's crucial, of course, to the United Nations, to what we do at the United Nations. And therefore, what I'll try to do tonight is give you an overview from my own perspective, towards the end adding some personal anecdotes and experiences, but in the beginning, trying to kind of share with you where I think thinking on this issue is at, the literature, the analysis, the empirical studies, what do we know, what don't we know, and then, as I said, I'll go to some more personal aspects of it. Before I start, I do want to say, however, that the United Nations Development Program is deeply involved in issues of governance, more from the economic and social side than from a purely political side. Of course, it's more the political part of the United Nations, the Department for Political Affairs and so on, that deals with the purely political aspects. But we on the development side deal with the implementation of governance issues, elections, and many other aspects of democratic governance. And indeed, right now, democratic governance is the biggest part. Supporting democratic governance has become the most important part of our program. I would say about 40–45% of the resources of the UNDP are allocated to activities that support democratic governance. Statistic we often quote these days is that on average, once every 2 weeks, the UNDP, in cooperation with DPA, is involved in supporting an election somewhere around the world. Now, in terms of looking at the literature, which many of you, I'm sure, know better than I do, particularly the political scientists, there is a vast literature on the relationship between democracy and development. It starts perhaps with modernization theory, Lipset, and the thesis that as countries grow richer, as citizens are more prosperous, they demand more freedom, they demand more democracy. So the kind of causality running from development, economic growth to democracy indicators. I think with time and this was done, of course, in the late 50s, early 60s, when many countries were still colonies, and therefore the set of countries that one could analyze at that time was rather restricted. I think there still remains some validity in that causality. In other words, it is easier to sustain democratic institutions and to have well-functioning democratic institutions at a level of development that is somewhat higher. It is harder in extreme poverty and extreme underdeveloped situations. However, the last few decades have shown us that there is no tight relationship. You can have poor countries that have gone quite far in democracy and democratic participation, and you have countries that with higher income levels that are way behind on that. So that the association is not as strong as perhaps the early proponents of modernization theory would have it. There is a study also that shows that what matters is not just income level, but it's also how well you're doing relative to your existing level of income. In other words, countries that are growing, where prosperity is increasing, are able to develop democratic freedoms more easily than countries who may be richer, but where the actual prosperity levels are going down. So it's the rate of change that matters as well as the actual level. There has been a lot of interest, of course, in the other direction of causality, not from economic development to democracy, but the other way around. From political institution freedoms democratic participation to development. The big question being, does development actually help? Does democracy actually help development? And, on that, the early thoughts and the early literature was, of course, rather negative and rather pessimistic. I think Professor Bagwati gave a lecture to this group, or to a related group rather recently, where he reminded us of what he calls the cruel dilemma, the way it was perceived in the 50s and 60s, where a predominant view among economists was that to get growth, you needed to have a high investment rate. And in order to extract that investment rate from societies that are quite poor, authoritarian regimes which forced societies to save and to invest did better than democracies where it was much more difficult to mobilize those investment funds. There was a time when one of the key textbooks in economics, Paul Samuelson's textbook, kind of said, without quite saying it in a very clear way, but implied that probably the Soviet Union would overtake the US in terms of economic welfare and prosperity. Why? Because the Soviet system extracted a huge surplus from its population, forced the population to save, and invested a lot of funds. The investment rate in the Soviet system was between 40 and 45% for decades. And, the US invests between 20 and 25% over that period. So if you make a mechanical computation with fixed productivity growth assumptions, you end up, with the societies that invest a lot growing much faster. Of course, history has shown that what is not only as important, but perhaps even more important than the investment rate per se, is the efficiency with which these resources are utilized, and the total factor productivity growth driven by innovation and entrepreneurial activity. And therefore, those models of growth that overemphasize the sheer quantity of investment ended up being very misleading, and we've had authoritarian systems ending up growing very little, or apparently growing, but then when one looked at the actual quality of the output produced, of course it fell very much short. And that's the history, in a way, of the world economy over the last few decades. We've seen very centralized and authoritarian systems not do very well at all, and much more decentralized democratic systems do much better. So the cruel dilemma of the 1950s and 60s, thankfully, wasn't a real dilemma, and the early theories that linked authoritarian regimes to higher growth rates actually fell apart. Having said that, unfortunately for Democrats, I should say, it is also not quite true to say that there is a very clear empirical association leading from democratic institutions and freedoms to better economic performance. It's not as simple. You do have quite a few examples of countries with fairly, decent democratic institutions not doing so well, or at least with apparent democratic institutions not doing so well. And you do have some authoritarian regimes who actually are doing quite well on the development axis. So if one is intellectually honest and looks at the evidence, one has to be more careful in making such statements. What does turn out to be true in terms of the evidence we have is that there is a positive association that runs from democratic institutions, democratic development, to good governance, and then from good governance to better economic performance and economic growth. What's critical in that link is that we need democratic institutions and I'm not talking purely from an economic point of view. There are other considerations, but from an economic development point of view, it is very, very important that the type of democracy we have, the type of democratic participation we develop, leads to good governance, leads to the rule of law, leads to predictability in economic policies, leads to a business environment where entrepreneurs, domestic or foreign, can invest with some confidence that the rules won't change overnight. And of course, the need for security, physical security in a country. All these things are very, very important for economic development. And And for democracy to foster development and to be successfully associated with good economic performance, it has to be the kind of democracy that develops that type of governance. And that is not automatic. You can widen democratic freedoms, have elections, have competitive parties and all that, and not necessarily have the good governance that's needed for good economic performance. That's what the data show, and I think there's a lot of literature now going more deeply into these issues. A few more points on the literature. One dimension that is important is that transition economies, particularly, of course, transitions from extremely centralized and authoritarian political and economic systems. When you go from such a system to more democracy and greater decentralization, that transition is very complicated and very difficult to manage, as we saw in Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union space. And there are very important sequencing issues there that one has to be careful about. One particular problem, when you have a system that is deeply flawed and that has tremendous obstacles to development and to efficiency built into it, is that reform is often very costly in the beginning. Reform is an investment into the future, but like all investment, it costs you at the beginning. Or you can liken it sometimes to surgery. You know, you're chronically ill, you have a real problem, you have to have surgery. When you do have the surgery, you actually in the beginning feel worse, obviously, or immediately after the surgery, you know, you very often feel worse. And then the improvements come over time. Now, of course, if you then take, you know, the patient to a democratic election right the day after surgery or before surgery, you're not likely to get a very good result. So part of the problem of moving, you know, of reforming systems, both in the political and economic sphere, are these timing issues. And, you know, there's no obvious answer to that, but one has to keep that in mind when one evaluates the development of various systems. Another point that comes out of the literature is the importance of history and of geography. There's a recent article by Persson and Tabellini who provide some very good evidence from the past that two strong explanatory variables in terms of how a country does in terms of democratic development and the persistence of democratic freedoms is how much democracy it had in the past, how much experience of democracy it has, and second, in what kind of neighborhood it is. Both factors are strong explanatory variables. If a country has had the experience of democracy before, it tends to do much better, you know, even though there may have been a dictatorship in the meantime. When the democracy comes back, it's quicker to adapt to it, it's quicker to be successful than countries that didn't have that experience in the past. And the same goes for neighborhoods. There are neighborhood effects that if you kind of are in a good neighborhood, quote, from a democratic point of view, it's easier also for you to implement democratic reforms and to develop democratic freedoms more deeply. I think these are the key facts that come out of the empirical literature and the theoretical literature. Very quickly, of course, it's a very complex and rich literature, but I thought it was worth highlighting these. Now, having said that, I would like to add two important caveats, two important qualifiers. First, of course, economic development is not the only reason why we want to have democracy. Democracy is a good in itself, is something positive in itself. In the UNDP literature, we call it human empowerment. It is something that's valued and valuable apart from income growth. So, you know, in analyzing the links between democracy and development, economic development, one should never forget that human empowerment is a source of happiness and of well-being in itself, even if it isn't associated with higher income levels. There are many, many studies that show how important these human empowerment variables are. Some of you may have seen the World Bank-sponsored study, Voices of the Poor, by Deepa Narayan, how important it is, for example, in the lives of poor people that they can trust the police that they can actually go to the police station and get some help when they have a problem, instead of being afraid of the police, just to give you one example. So I don't want to sound narrowly economic when I evaluate the role of democracy in development. That's the first point. The second point, and that's a problem for empirical studies, of course, is that one has to be careful when generalizing from history. A lot of the studies deal with the last few decades. Some of them actually go back to the mid-19th century, go back 150 years. And analysts organize panel data, time series, cross-section data, and try to find these associations. But I do believe that there is actually, history moves on. And what was valid 50 years ago, even empirically valid, may be quite different today. The world changes, perception changes. What is acceptable at a particular period of history is no longer acceptable today. What works at a particular time in history may no longer work today. And I think we really have to take all these historical studies with a grain of salt, because we live today in the year 2006. We look forward to 2010, 2015, and the world 5 years from now is a very different world from 1980 or 1950. We have to remember that, because it's inherent in these empirical studies that they're backward-looking rather than forward-looking. Of course, my own country, Turkey, is perhaps worth thinking about in this context. How each historical period has its own logic and its own context. Turkey in the 1930s was a country led by an authoritarian leader who is much loved in Turkey still today, founder of the Turkish Republic. In the 1930s, it was not a multi-party democracy, but when you compare Turkey in 1930 to Europe 1930s, actually Turkey was miles ahead of most European countries in terms of the rule of law, the role of parliament, the security of individual people, and things of that sort. When you compare it, to Italy at that time, Germany, most of Eastern Europe, Spain, Greece, that was Europe in the 1930s. Okay, there was France, there was UK, there was some Nordic countries, but that Europe was a very different Europe, and on many indicators, Turkey was ahead. So when you then compare that to the 1980s, of course, it's a very different story. So what I'm trying to say is that each period has its own logic, its own context, and when one analyzes things, one has to, I think, analyze them within that context. Two more points. One is the issue of markets and governments in this whole debate. And it's a big topic, and I'm not going to go into details, but when we look at the development of Western democracy, we really realize that the development of competitive markets went hand in hand with the development of strong democratic institutions. In the words of Ruggie or also Polanyi, markets were embedded in human and political institutions. They were not functioning without these political institutions. And sometimes, particularly economists, and particularly very kind of free market, extreme free market economists, sometimes forget that every successful market system in history has been embedded in strong governance. Now, when you look at the developing countries, you often miss that. You have markets that are developing, you have actually a lot of wealth in the private sector, and you have very weak governance. I was talking to our representative in Kabul the other day, and I asked, how much does a middle to high level civil servant earn in the Afghan government now? Somebody who has to either manage the provision of health services or security, or the security people are getting a little bit more, or a tax inspector or whatever. It's $50 a month, And the same goes in many African countries. How much does a director general earn? $100, $80 a month, And this is in a world where in the same countries, actually not so much in Afghanistan because of the safety problems, but the private sector actually makes considerably higher incomes. And it's very, very hard, to build up a civil administration in these countries without dealing with this capacity problem of the public administration of the civil service. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is corruption, non-transparent practices, which are one of the major obstacles, preventing good economic performance. But I would go further than that. It's what my friend Moises Naim calls illicit. In other words, the takeover of large parts of society by illegal, extra-legal mechanisms, drug cartels, drug pushers, arms salesmen, and general criminal activity. You have parts of cities, parts of countries, unfortunately, taken over by these extra-legal networks. And it's one of the real difficult problems we have to face in talking about the development of democracy and of good governance. We do need, besides markets, which of course we need good markets, private sector and all that, but we have to, I think, remind ourselves that we also need strong governments, strong public administrations with decent salaries that can actually provide the judicial and legislative and governing framework for the working of decentralized market and the private sector. And I think too often we don't give enough stress to that. So one of the key I think objectives and missions of UNDP is to try to help in that, to try to help build the capacity of good governance. And also we have to face the fact that, very often donors are willing to pay for flying in consultants from abroad who rightly are paid, good salaries. They live in rich countries. That's where their living is. So they get paid a rich country salary for their good work in a developing country, but then they leave. Whereas the real need very often is to somehow increase those salaries that I mentioned a while ago, which are ridiculously low and which don't allow the capacity creation that we need in many of these countries. And this whole fight against illegality, I think, is a very serious issue that perhaps we're not addressing enough. I firmly believe many groups that appear as terrorist groups or appear political, very often what's driving them is drug money or other illicit activities, and the political clothing is really only part of it. The real driving force is often the criminal activities behind it. Last point on this whole debate is something I think is particularly important to share with an American audience, and that is that in today's interdependent world, one cannot really be a Democrat, in my view, and deeply believe in democratic values and be a proponent of democracy and try to develop democracy, unless one also thinks about the global aspects of democracy. In my recent book, I have a little quote that says, democracy, I can't remember the exact quote now, but democracy has been left, at the national border, standing there without a passport. What is meant by that quote is that so many issues in today's world are cross-boundary issues, whether it's disease, whether it's security, environmental issues. The world has to cooperate on global issues in many dimensions, on many questions. And so when we argue for the development of democracy within the boundaries of a nation state, the underlying value system, I think, that makes us argue for democracy is the respect of human rights and the equality of human beings. Basically, you can argue about the exact legislative system, electoral system. But bottom line is, if you don't have a one woman, one man, one vote system, in some sense, you can weight the votes, you can have upper chambers, senates, and all that. But the bottom line is, each human being is equal and has a vote. And that is, after all, one of the absolute key aspects of democracy. Well, if you think of it in that way, then it is very odd that in the Security Council of the United Nations, for example, the institution which has the greatest amount of power in the United Nations. India, with its 1+ billion people, 1.1 billion, I think, almost right now, and moreover, which is a democracy, so it also has the legitimacy of itself being a democracy, that India is not sitting in the Security Council. What I want to say by that is that you can't really hope for strong progress of democratic principles and values and commitments throughout the world if one isn't at the same time willing to redesign a little bit, re-equilibrate, reorder the governance of the international system so that within the international institutions, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, the developing countries, and particularly the countries with large populations who have a large stake in the international system, don't increase their weight and their say. I think this is a very important aspect of the whole debate on democracy, which we should not forget. How to do it, of course, can be debated. There's a very interesting dilemma between countries as actors in the international system, individual countries, the one country, one vote kind of thing, which of course reflects the fact that sovereign nations are still the building blocks of the international system, and therefore one has to give each sovereign nation